It was another peaceful afternoon, the kind that had characterized my post-divorce life. The rain fell softly on the windows, an ordinary but constant reminder of my loneliness. I was curled up on the couch, absent-mindedly stroking my cat, Milo, who had become my closest companion in the void that had enveloped my home. The sudden sound of the front door creaking open startled me and snapped me out of my reverie. Standing in the doorway, drenched from the rain, was my nephew Andrew. He wasn't due to visit until next weekend, but here he was, flashing his boyish smile and holding a bag of groceries. "Surprise," he said, shrugging off his wet jacket and tousling his damp hair. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to hide my surprise with a smile. "Thought I'd come early, I hope that's okay," he replied, putting the groceries on the counter. Now 24, Andrew had matured into a confident young man, exuding a mixture of youthful exuberance and a wisdom that seemed unusual for his age. Every time I saw him, I was taken aback by this transformation. "Of course it's okay," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "You know you're always welcome." We fell into our usual easy conversation. Andrew had a knack for making the house feel warm with his laughter and stories about his life, his job, his aspirations for university, and his daily escapades. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a cozy atmosphere as we sat on the floor with Milo weaving between us. Andrew playfully tugged on Milo's tail, prompting an annoyed smack from the cat. His laughter filled the room, a joyous sound that warmed the air. "You've taken good care of him," he said, glancing at Milo before turning his gaze to me. His gaze lingered, both gentle and inquisitive. "He's all I have to look after these days," I replied lightly, though my words carried an unspoken weight. Andrew's expression softened. "You have me," he said sincerely. "I know it's not the same, but I like being here with you. It feels right." His comment stirred something in me, an emotional pang I tried to ignore. I deflected it with a laugh, brushing the moment aside. "You're too sweet for your own good." But as the afternoon wore on, I couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in his demeanor. The way he leaned in closer when he spoke, hesitating slightly before pulling away from a light touch. Was it my imagination, or was my loneliness distorting my perception? In the evening, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Andrew and I settled down in the lounge with a bottle of wine he had brought. The once quiet house buzzed with our chatter. We laughed about the time he accidentally coloured Milo pink as a child, and how I had forgiven him almost immediately, despite my initial anger. "You were always my favourite," he admitted with a grin. "I know I'm not supposed to say that, but it's true." His candour surprised me, but I couldn't help smiling. "Well, you've always had a place in my heart too," I confessed, my voice warm. As the evening wore on, our conversation took a more personal turn. Andrew revealed his insecurities, his career, his relationships, and the lingering sense of uncertainty about his future. "It's strange," he mused, swirling the wine in his glass. "I thought I'd have it all figured out by now, but I don't. Sometimes I just wish I had someone who really understood me." His honesty was raw, and I felt a pang of sympathy as I listened, wanting to offer comfort but not knowing how. "You'll get through this," I reassured him gently. "You're intelligent and compassionate. Life has a way of working itself out." "You're kind too," he said, meeting my gaze. "You're the kind of person who deserves more than this, more than being alone." His words hung in the air, creating an unspoken tension between us. I looked away, concentrating instead on my glass of wine. "You're too good at flattery." "It's not flattery, it's just the truth," he replied quietly. At that moment, something shifted, an invisible connection that drew us closer. It was subtle, yet palpable, and left me unsettled. When our hands brushed as we reached for the same bottle of wine, it was a fleeting touch, but it lingered in my mind far too long. I felt a jolt of something, an electric awareness I couldn't define. "You're quiet," he said, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" "Nothing," I lied, my heart pounding. He didn't press further, but his gaze held mine for a moment too long, making it clear he wasn't convinced. I quickly looked away, trying to calm my racing heart. The evening wore on, but the atmosphere between us remained charged. Every laugh and glance felt heavier, filled with an intensity we both avoided addressing. As the rain continued to pour outside, I found myself inexplicably drawn to Andrew. His presence filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep, yet the boundaries of our relationship blurred, leaving me confused about what was real and what was my own longing. After he retired for the night, I sat alone, staring at the empty wineglass in my hand. The warmth Andrew had brought was still there, but so was the weight of all that had been left unsaid. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, but that spark came with a shadow, a reminder that some boundaries, once crossed, can never be undone. The power went out just as the rain began to fall, plunging the house into complete darkness. The sudden lack of light created an unusual silence, broken only by the sound of rain drumming on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. I instinctively reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but Andrew was already approaching, his voice breaking the silence. "Looks like we're stuck with candles," he said with a hint of amusement. I managed a nervous laugh, though it was more anxious than humorous. The darkness was too intimate. As I searched for candles and lit them, their soft glow changed the atmosphere, casting flickering shadows that heightened the unspoken tension between us. Andrew sat on the floor by the couch, leaning against the coffee table with his knees drawn up. The candlelight accentuated his features, making him look older, more serious as his steady gaze focused on me, unreadable yet intense. "You seem different tonight," he said softly after a moment, his tone serious. "Different how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as my heart raced. He shrugged and gave a small, mysterious smile. "I don't know. It's like you're showing me a side of you that no one else sees." I considered laughing it off to change the subject, but the sincerity in his words took me by surprise. I couldn't deny the attraction I felt for him, despite my attempts to deny it. "Maybe it's the wine," I joked, trying to ease the tension. "Maybe," he replied, though his gaze remained fixed on me. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions. Every glance and movement seemed to carry more weight than it should. When Andrew finally stood and walked towards me, it felt like a natural progression, a culmination of the feelings that had been building between us for weeks. He came close enough that I could feel his warmth despite the cool air. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he murmured. "You're not," I replied, though my voice revealed my fear. Time blurred as he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I froze, torn between the logical part of me that urged caution and the undeniable attraction that pulled me closer. Then, without hesitation, his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, but when I didn't pull away, it deepened. In that moment, everything I had been suppressing, loneliness, longing, vulnerability, surfaced and threatened to overwhelm me. When we finally broke apart, the air was thick with tension and I couldn't meet his eyes. My heart was pounding and my thoughts were a jumbled mess. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, concern in his tone. I nodded, though my voice trembled as I said, This shouldn't have happened." "But it did," he replied simply, his voice steady, "and I don't regret it." I wanted to argue, to convince both him and myself that it had been a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, unable to resist the fleeting comfort he offered. Morning came too soon, bringing a muted golden light that seeped through the curtains. It should have been soothing, but it only added to the weight of what had happened. Sleep had eluded me as I replayed the events of the night, struggling with how something so wrong could feel so right at that moment. When I entered the kitchen, Andrew was already there making coffee as if nothing had changed. He greeted me with a soft smile, though there was an unfamiliar silence in the air. It wasn't exactly awkward, but the ease we once had was noticeably absent. "Coffee?" he asked, offering me a cup. I nodded and offered a quiet "thank you." As I sat at the table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, I felt his gaze on me, waiting for me to say something, to recognize the undeniable change between us. "We need to talk about this," I finally said, my voice hesitant. "I know," he replied, sitting across from me. "But before we do, I want you to know that I don't regret it." His words hit me hard. I looked up, looking for any sign of hesitation, but he looked sincere. "Andrew, we can't just pretend it didn't happen, but we can't let it happen again," I said, my voice shaking. "It was a mistake." "Was it?" he asked calmly but firmly. "Because it didn't feel like one to me. It felt real." His words tightened my chest. Part of me agreed, but that didn't change the fact that it felt wrong. Just then, his phone buzzed on the counter. He looked at it, and his expression changed. "It's Emily," he said quietly. The name hit me like a shock. Emily, his girlfriend. The reality of what we had done weighed heavily on me. This was not just about us. It was about her and the trust we had both betrayed. "You should take her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, looking at me, before stepping out to answer the call alone. I stared into my untouched coffee, the weight of my decisions weighing on me. When Andrew returned, he seemed torn. "She wants to meet later," he said. I nodded, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "You should go. You need to work out what you want, Andrew, and it can't be me. This, whatever this is, it has to stop." His sadness was obvious, but he didn't argue. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "You won't," I replied, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "But it can't happen again." After he left, the house felt emptier than it had for a long time. I sat by the window, watching the rain fall again, and thought about my choices. Loneliness was no excuse for crossing boundaries, no matter how tempting it seemed at the moment. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could make sure it never happened again. As the rain poured down, I resolved to do better, even as the pain in my chest reminded me of what I had lost.